I won't be calling an election. The threshold was not satisfied.
Kudos and shout out to the people who led the recall effort. It was a democratic right to do that. Shout out to the people who may have been on the other side. Let's stop the fighting.
Well, Mayor Cantrell thanks New Orleans residents for trusting in her leadership after news the recall effort failed. Recall organizers say they're exploring all legal options. Tonight, we have an in-depth look at how many signatures were certified. Good evening, I'm Meg Gatto.
And I'm Liz Reyes. New Orleans election officials declared nearly 60% of the signatures submitted as part of the petition invalid.
According to documents from the Orleans registrar, Sandra Wilson, recall organizers submitted a little more than 67,000 signatures late last month as part of their petition. They needed almost 45,000 to trigger a recall election. Wilson says staffers worked nights and even weekends to meet the deadline, which was actually tomorrow.
The Orleans registrar certified 27,000 of the signatures. The other nearly 40,000 signatures were disqualified for a range of reasons, including incorrect voter information and signatures from people who were not registered voters. So that means organizers were short more than 17,000 signatures.
Mayor Cantrell responded to the news with a message of moving forward. In a statement, she says, quote, "We must heal and recommit ourselves to working collaboratively to continue the progress we've made toward reducing crime, increasing public safety, building a more sustainable and resilient city, and creating economic and job opportunities that benefit all of our people."
The signatures came in 2 batches to the Orleans Parish Registrar's office. In the second batch, 32,421 signatures were submitted. Only 24 of those signatures were considered valid and counted.
We spoke to Governor John Bel Edwards soon after the signatures were delivered to the state capitol today.
As Sabrina Wilson reports, Edwards says a recall election won't be called because not enough valid signatures were on the petition submitted to the registrar.
180 days after starting the recall petition drive, recall leaders delivered boxes of signatures to New Orleans registrar Dr. Sandra Wilson. But it turns out they fell short of the number needed to force a recall election against Mayor Cantrell.
As required by law, the petitions themselves were delivered to my office this morning.
Not only did the registrar deliver the signatures, but also this certification letter to the governor's office. And in turn, the governor sent this letter to Registrar Wilson acknowledging that his office was in possession of her letter and delivery of the certification and petition to recall Cantrell. The signatures were brought to the state capitol before Edwards headed to a speaking event in Hammond.
The certification indicated that the number of electors in Orleans Parish at the start of the recall petition was right at 225,000. As you know, 20% of those voters have to sign the petition in order for the threshold to be met. That would be about 45,000, just shy of 45,000. The number of valid signatures certified to me was 27,000. So it's about 12% rather than 20%, and thus I won't be calling an election. The threshold was not satisfied.
It's an enormous amount of failed signatures. It seems something must have gone wrong beyond the normal course of action. Generally, you would see 20, maybe even 30%, but to have 60% of signatures failed suggests something went very wrong.
Under Louisiana law, registered voters had 5 days after the signatures were originally submitted to the registrar to remove or add their names. Joshua Spivak is a national recall expert and senior research fellow at Berkeley Law's California Constitution Center.
There seemed to be that this extra 5-day period is just for signatures collected afterwards. I assume that's the reading of the registrar.
The governor says over 39,000 signatures were found to be invalid.
I think it was 12.11% was the percentage of qualified electors that actually signed the petition. And so while there were an awful lot of signatures, there weren't that many that were valid. And so it would be hard for me to believe that a court will upend that certification.
Have you in the past seen it where there were more signatures tossed out than were accepted?
Yes, there's this one case in Cleveland where they didn't sign something and like they tossed out 98% of the signatures. It was only 12,000 signatures compared to here.
For his part, Governor Edwards says he did not speak to Registrar Wilson when she dropped off the signed petition to the state capitol.
They brought those to the petitions and the certification to the Capitol. They were put in the freight elevator and just brought up to the 4th floor. I was actually in a meeting. I didn't speak with her. When I got out of the meeting, I was told that they were there. I looked at the boxes of petitions. They're under lock and key. First of all, the boxes themselves are locked, and they're in a locked portion of the governor's office.
Now, when asked about the difficulty in recalling elected officials, Edwards said he doesn't think you should be able to recall someone with just 12% of voters. However, he said he doesn't know what the threshold should be. He wouldn't comment on the deal struck between Secretary of State Kyle Ardoin and recall leaders lowering the number of signatures required. We reached out to Cantrell's lawyers for comment, but her campaign's PR man, Bill Roussel, said no interviews will be granted today. Meg.
Thank you, Sabrina. The organizers of the No Latoya recall say their effort has only begun and they're exploring their legal options. In a statement released less than an hour ago, they described the recall process as having countless obstacles. They say, quote, "We could have never known that the moment the petition was filed in August, the recall was doomed due to massive inaccuracies with the registrar of voters for New Orleans Parish. Additionally, the way the law is written now, the recall was required to get more signatures than votes Mayor Cantrell was required to get to be elected to office."